Okay.
All right. Hey, everybody. What's up? What's going on? And happy Wednesday for a special Wednesday edition of our Final Fantasy XVI lecture play series. If you are new to the stream or seeing us for the first time on YouTube, welcome. My name is Professor Noctis, real life Wade. I am an actual university professor at the University of Alabama where I teach religion, religious studies, and Final Fantasy. Started out on Final Fantasy 15 and currently finishing up a lecture play series, as we call it, on Final Fantasy 16. Having just finished up the Final Fantasy 16 DLC, Echoes of the Fallen, this is a game that warrants some additional conversation. So I wanted to bring on a good buddy of mine, a fellow scholar and
Mhm.
author. His name is M.J. Gallagher. You may know him from such books as, and I've got mine right here, Greek myths that inspired Final Fantasy VII. He also wrote Norse myths that inspired Final Fantasy VII, and just a great all-around guy. So, MJ, why don't you introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you so much, Wade. That what a beautiful opening and introduction that was, and I really appreciate the plug. I didn't come prepared at all, for that. Um, no, I'm joking. I do really appreciate that. Hello to everyone who's joined us
Yeah.
this afternoon or this evening, depending on where you are, I guess. I'm MJ Gallagher. As Wade said, my most recent contribution to the Final Fantasy community has been the books Norse Myths that inspired Final Fantasy VII and Greek Myths that inspired Final Fantasy VII, which actually only released a couple of months ago. Um, I have been working, or been a huge fan of the Final Fantasy series for, the best part of 25 years now. Final Fantasy VII is absolutely my favourite. And I actually started off as a fan fiction author. Became involved in various projects. No including sort of the Final Fantasy fan community, KuppelCon. So I produced standalone novels for them, like the Nibelheim Incident, which deals with Final Fantasy VII, or co-authored Seed the Beginning with American author Mike Rodney, which deals with Final Fantasy VIII. Um, but my real interest is sort of looking at the deep lore of the Final Fantasy games, particularly in respect to mythology and how the Final Fantasy series in general has evolved over the last 30 years from the origins of taking some Dungeons and Dragons sort of in-game lore and eventually expanding on that through Kazushige Najima and other writers.
Hmm.
And yeah, I'm one of these people that I'll actually never know if my interest in mythology came from Final Fantasy VII or if my enjoyment of the Final Fantasy series is because I love mythology. Because I think you'll know yourself that once you become quite invested in those types of myths, you can see them everywhere, and it gives you a very particular lens through which to sort of view media. Um, so I love it. And when it came to Final Fantasy 16, I was just blown away. I loved the game from start to
Yeah.
finish. And a lot of my personal enjoyment came from how much mythology and theology they cram into it.
Mm.
I just absolutely loved it. I'm currently working on a new book which I'll maybe speak more on at a later point. It's called Mythos Final Fantasy 16, which I intend to explore a lot of the same things, a lot of the mythology, a lot of the theology, and how this relates to the game itself. So please do keep an eye out for that. And as it happens, we have a lot to talk about as a result of that.
For real. For real, you had kind of answered one of my questions that I've kind of wanted to ask you. You and I have been on several different streams together. We've talked certainly a lot on Twitter or X now or whatever it's called, and just offline. But one of the things that I've found really captivating is you continue to say that you got into mythology, deep into mythology from Final Fantasy VII. So did you already have like a notion of mythology, or was that really the thing that said, "Hey, I want to know more about this"?
It was Final Fantasy, the series in general, particularly Seven, was something that gave me this sort of surface level understanding of mythology. When I was growing up, I sort of I was raised a Catholic, so I had a bit of biblical background. But when I was at school, I learned a number of the Norse myths and a little bit of the sort of classical myths. But because I went to a religious school, sort of classical studies wasn't on. It wasn't available for me to study, so I sort of missed out on that. But it was something that I always wanted to go back to and learn more about. And sort of playing the Final Fantasy games, and I guess it was like being poked with a stick of like remember you have to learn about this, remember you have to learn about that. I actually became a travel writer about 12 years ago. I lived in New Zealand and was given a job as a travel writer, which required sort of visiting cruise ship port cities all over the world and learning about the culture, learning about the history, and to produce tours for cruise ship passengers. And that opened my eyes a huge amount to sort of different cultures, different mythologies. And in particular, sort of comparative mythology, and you could start to see where some of the crossovers were. But what was even more interesting for me is that a lot of what I was discovering through that was like, hold on, I've seen that in Final Fantasy.
Yeah.
I've seen that in Final Fantasy. And particularly with the Norse mythology, that's when it started to click a little bit of, okay, there's a lot more going on than that I ever realised.
Yeah.
Just things such as the straw that actually broke the camel's back for me was realising that the Midgardsorm in Final Fantasy VII was a mistranslation of Midgardsorm, which is the world serpent in Norse mythology, and that sort of sent me down a rabbit hole, which eventually developed into the book of Norse myths that inspired Final Fantasy VII, and there's so much of it is deliberate, and it turns out with Final Fantasy VII in particular, that was kind of a turning point from the mythological side of things, because it wasn't relying so heavily on the Dungeons and Dragons stuff anymore. It was the one of the lead scenario writers, Kazushige Nijima, actually himself had a background in mythology and video games, and he brought that to Final Fantasy VII, and from then on it gets so interesting, and once you kind of know to look for these things, you can find it everywhere.
I mean, both of us have these kind of origin stories. For me, it was, a little bit of Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy VI to a degree. I remember seeing the final boss, the final tower, and like, oh my gosh, that's very religious iconography and art. And then when I moved into Final Fantasy X, and then ultimately, as everybody knows, if you followed me at any time, Final Fantasy 15, I tell the story of like, hey, I've got a few degrees in religious studies, and I'm playing through, and I'm like, this is the story of David. This is literally the story of David culminating in a messianic hope. And so I think it's really cool that video games do that. But today we are here for Final Fantasy 16 DLC Echoes of the Fallen. So everybody, you're tuning in. I hope that you have played or experienced or streamed, watched somebody else play Final Fantasy 16 and certainly the DLC. If not, then I'm going to ask you politely. I'd love for you to lurk, but also pause this conversation and maybe come back. because this is going to be a spoiler-filled conversation. It's no holds barred here. So we're going to be talking about everything from the main story into the DLC. So if that's not your cup of tea, thank you for being here, but bookmark it and come back. So
Yeah.
that's your one and only warning at this point. So at this point, I really would love for us to talk a little bit about our experiences playing the DLC. So, MJ, what was your experience playing the DLC? What mythological allusions or themes stood out most to you? Because I mean, if you're anything like me, we sit down playing the game, and like you and I, we're already looking for it. But
Yeah.
how shocked were you when we started getting hit with these things? What was that like for you?
Well, although I've actually been working on kind of content for Final Fantasy 16 ever since the game launched, I haven't directly played, sat down for any prolonged period of time to play. So this was a real, pleasant surprise to, effectively out of nowhere after the Game Awards, just to, okay, like that DLC is now available, off you go. So to be able to sit down and actually just invest time and just immerse myself back into the world of Valisthea was absolutely spectacular. And because of how heavily crammed with mythology and theology the main game was, I kind of expected there would be some. So my personal excitement was, okay, what can I find here? And when the DLC starts very early on, when you go to speak to Harpocrates, we're immediately told that this has very heavy connections to the sins of Zemeckis. So okay, right, now we're getting really serious. Like just right off the bat, this we're talking, deep lore. So that was something that really excited me, and I could keep my eyes out for the kind of the Book of Genesis type references that were going to creep up time and time again. I really loved
Were
as well.
you already interested in the sins of Zemeckis? But just from the
I
main
was.
game? Yeah.
I
What
was.
were you making of that? Because I mean, I saw it and I knew that it was this cataclysm of the fallen, right? Of this former race and this battle between the fallen now and the gods. But what were your kind of inclinations on that one?
Well, looking at the sins of Zemeckis, I took three particular stories from Genesis away from that because I feel that it amalgamates three particular divine punishment stories. The first being the fall of man, and sort of Adam and Eve. The second being the Great Flood, and the third being the Tower of Babel
Yeah.
or Babel. So the way that the sins of Zemeckis, obviously the way that the story develops, and then the tomes explain it. You get bits and pieces of information all over the place, so you have to kind of work hard to weave it all together. But I found it so interesting that effectively the fallen going after it in the first place, building the airships, reaching the heavens, um, going after the mother crystal in the first place, very much dealt with hubris, and how the gods punished hubris, particularly in the aftermath that it seemed as if the fallen civilization was then fragmented and sent, just dispersed, which is effectively what the Tower of Babel story is about.
Right.
It's a lot of people simply believe that it's a parable about why different tribes across the ancient world spoke different languages and so on and so forth. Alternatively, even some people argue that it's more of a cradle of civilization type story, which also works in this instance because it's the fall of the fallen and the rise of the sort of modern cultures. The second one, the fall of man element, I felt was this is something that they really go into in Echoes of the Fallen, but it kind of skimmed the surface a little bit in the main game of the Fallen were looking to obtain knowledge of God, and what one of the things that I kind of took away from that was there's almost this reversal that the punishment, or in Genesis, God punishes Adam and Eve by making them self-aware, and kind of sending them off into the world, whereas the punishment after the sins of Zemeckis, so they already talk about that was like the first archy.
Yeah.
So what it infers is that at the time, how Ultima punished mankind was that he cast Primogenesis, which, as we know from most of the latter sections of Final Fantasy XVI, is that leads to ether floods, which then turns a lot of people Akashic. And the point of turning people Akashic is that you remove their free will.
Yeah.
Which is the reverse of what God does to Adam and Eve.
Exactly.
In Genesis. So I found that contrast really quite interesting. And of course, the last one is quite simply just the Great Flood story of God looks upon mankind and sees corruption. He sees too much violence and decides just to destroy it and start again. Which, basically the entirety of Final Fantasy 16, we're looking at this fallen civilization. Where there's literally the landscape is littered with signs of this. So you can't ever get away from the fact that that civilization was destroyed.
Yeah.
I particularly found it very interesting that we're not while we're talking about the Book of Genesis, it's as I'm sure you kind of covered extensively, that we're actually talking about the Gnostic version of Genesis. We're not talking about the Judaism or Christian version. So there was that's why I got really excited when the DLC started with, okay, we're going to talk about the sins of Zemeckis now. Like, okay, here we go. Let's get some real interesting stuff now.
No, it's so great because, I mean, you've got this really enticing crater, right, with all of this water and stuff, and something happened here. They really build that up. And when they first announced that there was going to be some DLC, my hope was, oh man, I hope we get something about the Fallen, because I really want to know about those sins of Zemeckis and stuff. I mean, in a pipe dream, I was like, maybe we'll get to play as Jill or Dion or Joshua or something. But I kind of had an inkling that it was like, we're going to dive deep into these two missing pieces of the Fallen, and then ultimately Leviathan, which we'll end the stream today talking a little bit about that. With all of this, I mean, your primary focus is oftentimes, from the books at least, Norse and Greek mythology, but you have a knowledge of all of this other mythology. My primary training is in ancient Near Eastern mythology, particularly in Hebrew and pre-Christian mythologies, particularly surrounding kingship and Babylonian sacred kingship narratives. And then I've got a lot of theology aspects in there as well, which is why the mythos logos thing works really well for me. Because for example, you are like King Mythos over here. I love that. In fact, like that's the title of your upcoming book, right? Mythos, right?
Yeah.
And for me, the mythos is so important as it undergirds this logos mentality, which I would liken to what do we do with this, the reason, the logic, and the kind of way forward. And so with all of that, part of the conversation that I really am interested in today is we're going to talk about a lot of the myths, a lot of the stories of origin that come to play here. And you've talked about Babel, the big three in Genesis 1 through 11. But once we kind of lay out all of that, my hope is we can answer that question of why tell these stories? Like, why retell these stories? So, chat, that's where we're building to today. So we're going to first talk about some of these things. Then we're going to go into why in the world would Square Enix want to tell these stories again today. So let's kind of get down to the nitty gritty. We'll talk about the Tower of Babel in just a little bit, but I was really struck playing through the game with the names of enemies of certain figures and characters, and I was like, oh man, MJ's going to have a time with this one. So tell us a little bit about what you took from Famiel and some of the enemies particularly.
Sure, yeah. Well, there are a number of quite interesting ones. Omega itself is a really interesting one, which I think we should come back to. So what I think is maybe a good idea is just to sort of whet chat's appetite a little bit with some of the things that I noticed. Um, Something that I thought was really cool is that there are three before we even come on to Famiel, there's three types of monsters that crop up within the tower that they're ancient versions of monsters that you fight throughout the game, sort of recurring monsters. The first one is the Domovoi and Domovichka, and apologies if I've mispronounced those. Basically, they are described in the tomes as ancient goblins that were used in research of the fallen in a way of sort of crafting the dusk crystals. Now, Domovoy and Domovichka are actually the same being. It's just male and female, or Domovichka in particular are the wives of the Domovoy, and these are household spirits from Slavic folklore, and are quite often benevolent. But what's actually really interesting about these guys is that when we think of goblins in general, the sort of pop culture way of looking at goblins is just small, magical, troublesome creatures.
Right.
And that is true from a sort of folklore mythology perspective. But it's actually a little bit deeper than that. It comes from sort of medieval European folklore, and like all sort of mythologies and folklore, it does differ from region to region. But goblins themselves were kind of thought of as being like fairies or sprites, but they were different in that rather than being sort of beautiful creatures that might like entice man or sort of trap them, they were just universally accepted as being grotesque. But and they were almost always accepted as being tricksters, but not necessarily malicious all the time. They could be, but it was almost a sort of give and take. Like they were goblins when you kind of look at literature. Goblins are actually almost always household tricksters. So the like kind of groups of or tribes of goblins are nomadic by nature, but they do tend to like they'll travel from region to region and stop off and actually invade people's homes. And how the household owner will treat the goblin depends, or will actually actively affect how the goblin then plays tricks on them.
Yeah.
Which I felt was really quite interesting, but that hasn't been overlooked by the Final Fantasy 16 team, because the first time we ever encountered goblins in Final Fantasy 16 is actually in Stillwind.
Stillwind, yeah.
Which they've actually migrated in because they're running away from the Blight, and they're now populating an abandoned village.
Yeah.
So we do get that sort of the nomadic element. We do get the household connection there. But we're now in a, like, when it comes to the DLC, the Domovoy, because these creatures actually come from Slavic folklore, that likely predates the other European literature, which makes them an ancient version of the goblin. They are effectively they've come back and they're in the house of the fallen that we now have access to. So they're the kind of household spirits of the tower itself. And of course, when we actually first encounter these guys, same again, they're very heavily connected with the Blight and running away. So we do have that kind of nomadic element as well. So I felt that that was really interesting. That if you're going to have this recurring beastman, that they go for an ancient version of the goblin in the Slavic folklore. And Slavic folklore is all over Final Fantasy 16, which I personally love because it's extremely rare that you find that. So for them to use that in particular was really interesting.
Yeah, I almost feel like this game is just like almost like a menagerie of all of these mythological elements. But you're exactly right. I mean, there's really isn't a ton of representation of Slavic folklore in gaming particularly, but here, I mean, you get it, and it seems to intersect and segue so beautifully with this overall story that is almost like a drive-by of all of the myths of the world and of history.
Yeah,
It's amazing.
but exactly, and it's not as if it's just wild. It's actually really quite well researched.
Yeah. Oh, it's
Like
incredibly well researched. I said this about 15 and even more about 16. They have got a next level research team looking at these religions, these myths, these folklores, and bringing them together. It's almost like they just have it all, these researchers, and they bring it to the scenario writers, and they're like, here, use this.
Yeah,
Amazing. I want that research
exactly.
team.
Exactly. So it's blown me away because it's no longer just sort of throwing things in for the sake of it. There's actually a purpose there. There's a
Yeah.
deeper meaning to it. Which again, but here we are. Just talking about the DLC, and already I've spent 10 minutes talking about goblins.
Mm-hmm.
But that's the level of detail they've gone to here. Okay, so the next one, and I think most people, this guy is one of the most iconic of all mythological beings. So I want to talk a little bit about Asterios. So for those familiar with classical mythology, you may already know that throughout Final Fantasy 16 there are numerous types of minotaurs.
Mm-hmm.
Um, they show up all over the place, and they have different names and various colours and whatnot. In classical mythology, there's actually only one Minotaur, and his name is Asterion, or alternatively Asterios,
Okay.
which means starry or the starry one. Okay, so when I mentioned earlier that the Sage Spire actually has ancient versions of particular beastmen or particular monsters. If you're going to pick one name for an ancient version of the Minotaur, you cannot get more perfect than Asterios. But Asterios' design is really interesting as well. Okay, and I'm actually going to read a passage from my book, my Greek mythology book, just because I think this captures it really quite well.
Yeah.
Okay, so while there are numerous versions of the story, the best known are generally credited to mythographers such as Pseudo-Apollodorus and Ovid. The legend begins with King Minos II, a great-grandson of Zeus, who rules Crete and its surrounding isles at the same time that King Aegeus, the mortal father of Theseus, rules Athens. One day, Minos prays to Poseidon for a sign that his sovereignty is favoured by the gods. Poseidon sends a magnificent white bull from the sea in response, expecting the king to sacrifice the beast in his honour. So beautiful is the creature that emerges from the waves, however, that Minos decides to offer up a bull from his own herd instead. The Lord of the Oceans is enraged by this act of impiety. To punish Minos, he curses his wife, Queen Pasiphae, so that she lusts after the white bull and falls pregnant to it. Poseidon then instills madness in the animal, and its rampage across Crete terrorises the island's populace. In due course, Pasiphae gives birth to a son called Asterion, usually depicted in the myths as having the body of a human and the horned head, hooves and tail of a bull. Minos commissions the famous inventor, engineer and architect Daedalus to design and construct a dwelling for Asterion adjacent to the royal palace, where the abomination can live while being unable to escape from it. Daedalus creates an elaborate maze-like complex full of twisting corridors, identical rooms, hidden alcoves, false doors, and dead ends. This is what becomes known as the labyrinth. Okay, so the reason for actually reading that is just to very clearly set the context for what Asterios or how Asterios is presented. Yeah. So Asterion is exclusive to the labyrinth myth. So the Sage Spire itself is obviously it's a stage or a dungeon in Final Fantasy XVI, which for the most part, actually with the exception of one tiny little bit where the path splits, there's only one way to go.
Yeah.
Okay, and the distinction between a labyrinth and a maze is that the labyrinth only has one route.
One way. Yeah.
Okay, so you're traveling this one way all the time through this ancient structure that has been designed by some of the most brilliant minds of an ancient civilization to finally get to Asterios. So that is almost exactly how the labyrinth myth plays out itself. What's even more interesting is that Asterios is white. So he's a white bull, which is almost certainly a direct reference to his father, the Cretan bull, who's this the kind of the beautiful white bull that Poseidon sends from the seas.
Yeah.
And the importance of this is that by sending the bull from the seas and then Minos deciding not to sacrifice it as expected, that's we can call that an act of hubris, which is when we're talking about a story, or the DLC talks about the fallen and the hubris of the fallen in the face of the gods, to actually take a story about the Minotaur and inject the actual hubris element of that. I found was absolutely fascinating.
Oh, that's good. That's good because I noticed the Minotaur, but then this idea about the hubris of that story, I did not pick up on that. So, gosh, that's golden. It makes sense how all of these mythologies, all of these mythos, again, are examining this idea of human arrogance, pride, hubris as trying to attain godhood. So, gosh, excellent work as always. Man, that's great. That's great.
So yes, I loved it. I thought that was so cool, and particularly because throughout Final Fantasy XVI itself, I'd been looking for a direct reference to Asterion.
Yeah.
And finally here in the DLC.
Yeah, they're just holding it back for you. You got to pay for that one.
Exactly. Man, that was worth it. It was worth
it is. Listen,
every cent.
You're telling me.
So the third monster that I want to talk about from a theological perspective is Angra Mainyu. Now, Angra Mainyu is a kind of changed skin enemy of the more sort of recurring Ahriman that we find throughout Final Fantasy XVI, which of course we've actually found for decades in the Final Fantasy games. And particularly what's actually really interesting about Angra Mainyu is that he is presented as having leathery skin and wings and curling ram horns. None of the other Ahriman that I'm aware of within Final Fantasy XVI actually have those ram-like horns.
No.
Now the ram horns, of course, are a common trait of the Christian devil. So the reason that this is very interesting is that Ahriman and Angra Mainyu are actually two names for the same being in Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrianism is a religion that the kind of branches of it originated in ancient Persia. So Ahriman is the Persian version of the name. That Persian version is actually a really cool thing to say. Yeah. And Angra Mainyu is the name in the Avesta. So the Avesta is the actual Zoroastrian literature.
Yeah.
So it's like I said, it's just two names for the same being, but kind of depending on the specific branch of Zoroastrianism you're looking at. Angra Mainyu is most commonly considered to be the spirit of chaos and destruction, or a malevolent creator deity who brings death, sickness, and evil into the world. Some sources give Angra a prominent role in the myth of how the universe is divided. And generally speaking, he dwells in the underworld or in a state of non-reality from where he orchestrates humanity's strife. Now, when you take those three things together, that he's a malevolent creator deity, that he is involved in how the universe was split up, and that he dwells in a state of non-reality. That really sounds like Ultima.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it?
Which I found really quite interesting. One of the things that takes this idea even further is that within Zoroastrian literature is that Angra is said to lead the Devas, which are the false gods in Zoroastrianism. So, of course, another word for false god is icon.
Right.
So we are with this Omega storyline, which is exploring how this man-made icon, literally this false man-made god, we've introduced this idea of Angra who in his own religion is the one who leads the false gods. And in particular, like as time has gone on, and Christianity has been introduced, Islam has been introduced, he then becomes equated with the Christian devil.
Yeah.
Which is really quite accentuated in the art and iconography of Angra in more recent centuries. So that hasn't been missed either by the design team. It's almost specifically that they've identified him with the Christian devil and have added the ram horns onto the design of the Ahriman for that exact purpose. Which so again, this is so deep. This is so that they haven't. This isn't just a sort of surface level idea that they've stuck in Angra here. It's so specific, and I loved it.
No, I thought that was absolutely incredible. And as I slept on it last night, because I just played the DLC last night and then thought about it further today, I think you're exactly right. The idea of Angra could have been that an end boss of the original game, because there are some parallels with Ultima, but this idea of putting him in this tower as this idea that he is man-made and then bringing in that mythology under this auspice of humans made this and did this maybe as a fear tactic, as a culmination of all of these other gods or thoughts of gods. Man, that again dives into not just the hubris, but also the control element of how can I build myself up and control the masses in this. Again, allowing the civilization now known as the Fallen to ascend to the heights of the gods. And they're utilizing this man-made thing to kind of do that. I think there's some inferences that could be made there. So that's incredible, incredible stuff. Also love the idea of... both in Zoroastrianism and then in Abrahamic religions, this idea of the devil and what does that do for the adherents and those devoted to that religion, that faith, right? And, it does instill some fear. It instills a little bit of purpose and mission, of resistance, of temptation, and all of that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, it also is about some behavior modification. Are you aligning with this or are you not? And that's where you kind of get into some dicey theological regions that promote some deconstructive moments, which I think is exactly what 16 does for a lot of people of faith, particularly.
Absolutely. I if any one of these had been in isolation, I would have thought, that's maybe a coincidence. But to have each of these in addition to what we're about to talk about, there's no way that this is an oversight. This is right on the nose, and I'm here for it. I'm here for it every single day.
Oh, me too. Me too. I mean, they just continue to deliver time and time again, not
Yeah,
just with this series, but especially with 16. I mean, the intentionality with which they are riffing on some of the mythologies and the stories throughout the entire game. I'm just like, oh my gosh, this is, like I said earlier, a menagerie, and it's causing us to deep dive into,
yeah,
what about religions or faiths or mythologies that explain this thing, this
yeah,
aspect of a compassionate God, or the justice of God is if there's a divine righteous law, and then wrath and all of that kind of stuff. This mentality of human hubris coming up to the level of the gods, and then even yeah, I think it's an interesting dichotomy, and then I'll get to my next question. I think it's an interesting dichotomy to show the hubris of the fallen, where they're trying to overthrow the gods, and the way that Clive is doing this as well,
hmm
because Clive is going up against Ultima. There is a level of commonality between the fallen and Clive, and they even speak to this at the end of the DLC. But
hmm
Clive is determined to do it a different way, a way
yeah,
that betters humanity. It's not about empowerment, but it is about freedom here.
absolutely, yeah,
I think that there's something so powerful. I work with a lot of students in religious studies where they bring in a ton of kind of hang-ups and chips on their shoulder, and there's an anger in we've got to demythologize the world. We need to demythologize all this stuff. And I'm like, whoa, maybe don't throw the baby out with the bathwater here.
yeah, yeah,
Let's really think about this, and what's going to promote freedom and agency and human autonomy, and then what are the things that do need to kind of be set off to the side. I think it's an amazing, important deconstruction conversation, which I think is like the overall theme of 16, but that's probably for a book or something. I don't know.
yeah. No, yeah. Well, I'll see about that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, off the back of that, one of the things that I really liked, and I think it was a sort of message that was sort of bubbling under the surface, is that um, after the fallen are, the kind of divided, kind of once Ultima destroys Zemeckis,
Yeah.
the later on in the game you learn about the Circle of Malice, and you learn about how the different cultures within Valisthea, many of them derive their beliefs from the Circle of Malleus,
Uh-huh.
and which itself derives originally from the kind of savior myth that was proposed by Ultima.
Mm-hmm.
And I like this idea of, it introduces the crossovers that you quite often find in comparative mythology, where there are so many similarities that what one individual might believe and a kind of neighbouring culture might believe, and a neighbouring culture to that might believe. When you kind of take a step back, you quite often find that actually we're all looking at the same thing from a different perspective.
Mm.
I quite like this idea that it's almost this, in a story of mythology and a story of kind of fighting for freedom, they've introduced this idea of commonality
Hmm.
in our origin, as it were. I kind of like that idea that it's there's very much a kind of philosophy behind that, of there's more, we share more in common than we know, that we think that
Yeah.
divides us. But again, that's a whole different rabbit hole.
You
That
know,
one.
this is something we talk about in, I've talked about it in my lecture play streams, but I really talk about it, deep dive into it in my classrooms, where theology, mythology, especially when you're looking in specific cultures, I liken it to a jewel that you hold up to the light, right? And whenever we're talking about the divine, there's a perspective, a lens, and a vantage point with which we are looking at it. And so it is impossible for me to look at theology or any concept of God or a personal belief of God outside of being a 2023 American male, right? It's very difficult for me to think outside of that. But the task of a good mythology scholar, of a theologian, of anybody, I think, is to slightly turn that jewel so that the light is refracted and you're able to see the nuances, the crevices, and all of the distinctions on that. And that's what I think this game does so well. It's like, okay, you understood who the divine was through the icon of Garuda, but what if we twisted it just a little bit? What if we saw Benedicta in this light? What does that make you think? And then what do you see as we look at Ifrit? And then ultimately with this, we're twisting it once again. The other thing that I'll say about this is that for a large part of humanity, and even today to a degree, cultures, religious communities, and specifically dogma-driven cultures fix the vantage point. And they say, we're not going to turn it to the left or to the right. We're going to look at it right like this. And any other perspective of this jewel is the wrong one. Okay? And it's kind of a again, hubris sort of thing, an arrogance, or those that are in it would simply say, you mean it's right. But I think that the task for an objective scholar, and even for a person that's going through a deconstructive process, is to say, okay, let me turn that jewel a little bit because there's beauty in the light refracting. I think it's a great thing that this game does.
Absolutely, and that is a wonderful analogy. Really wonderful analogy. I like that a lot.
Yeah. So as we continue to think, we're kind of going all around it. And in fact, I see the chat, El Tigre over here is talking about, so it's the Tower of Babel, right? It's the Tower of Babel. And I think it's time to talk about the Tower of Babel a little bit here. But I did want to ask one further question. We mentioned the names of the chief miner, Famiel. Anything just really briefly before we go to Babel about that?
Sure. Well, I actually looked into this and I couldn't find a huge amount. What I did find is that Famiel, his name does actually appear in a dictionary of angels by a Gustav Davidson, but Davidson doesn't actually cite where he got that, so I'm not sure if this is from medieval literature or if this even stems from the sort of Jewish texts or early Christian texts or whatever. What I did or what did jump out at me is that Famiel is said to live in the third heaven. So kind of other than that, there was other recommendations that there is also a Ramiel and a Tamiel, who are both mentioned in the Gospel of Thomas, which comes from Nag Hammadi, which my understanding is that the Gospel of Thomas is not outright considered Gnosticism, but obviously a lot of the scripts that were found at Nag Hammadi are considered Gnostic. So Ramiel and Tamiel are said to be fallen angels. So I found that quite interesting, that Famiel could particularly be down that route. But specifically looking at the third heaven angle, some Hebrew texts, and this is not my area of expertise at all, so please do correct me if I'm talking nonsense on this one. But some Hebrew texts say that God rests in the third heaven on his way to paradise, and that the tree of knowledge, or another text that's actually the tree of life, that is exists in the third heaven. Now, the tree of knowledge and the tree of life were obviously part of Genesis and part of the Garden of Eden, which again ties into the fall of man, which in a lot of terms is simply just called the fall, which is also, if you look at Final Fantasy 16, it does actually refer to the sins of Zemeckis.
Yeah.
As the fall,
right.
So there's actually a very direct link there. Another interesting thing that I found is that Moses and the Israelites of Exodus are also said to dwell in the third heaven, which when I kind of looked at Famiel, what jumped out at me was that either he was a fallen angel, or that when he talks about his ancient tribe, being the first ones to lose their lands as a result of the blight and having to kind of be forced to roam the twins. I wondered if that was actually a reference to the Israelites as well. So, well, I couldn't get a real distinct answer to who Famiel is referencing, but I do believe it's either the fallen angel route or it's talking about his tribe is a reference to the Israelites after they leave Egypt. Particularly the sort of the plague on Egypt that God rains down, which the blight is obviously a plague on the land. So beyond that, I'm just kind of theory crafting.
Yeah, no,
what about yourself? Did you have anything on
yeah, I
that?
really like that. I like that a lot because you're right. Those names do harken back to exactly some of the things that you're talking about in some of the more secondary texts of the Hebrew mythos, right? And what the way that I took that as I was playing through was that these people are remnants of that time. They are remnants of a time when there was less separation or less division or war, I guess, between God and humanity. And then there's this rift. And again, these are, I think it's just a subtle nod to they're not from around here. They're from like back then, or at least they're the legacy of that group. I think it's also
And
important that they're from
possibly one of the tribes that kind of were divided after God destroyed the Tower of Babel.
Exactly. And I think it's also interesting that we don't see them in the game Valisthea proper, right? It appears to me, and you could correct me on this, that they are from the north, at least from the vantage point of where they were seeing the tower. I think that's alluded. And so, like, they're a fallen, forgotten, nomadic group. I think that there are similarities to the Hebrew nomadic a group trying to find themselves, figure out their place in this world, having been expelled from the garden, which ultimately leads us to the Tower of Babel. Because again, this is the story of after the fall from the expulsion from the Garden of Eden, or the divine garden in some of the other texts of the time and of the day, Babylon, Mesopotamia.
Yeah.
After the flood, you have a people that are trying to get back to that. Now, this is what I found particularly interesting. And for the chat, I wanted to share a little bit about not just the Genesis 11 account of the Tower of Babel, but I wanted to share a little bit of some of the sensibilities from Babylon, the sensibilities of just ancient Near Eastern cultures. And so the Tower of Babel story, I want to begin with what most people kind of know. And this is the Genesis 11 text. So here's what it says, just as a reminder for everybody. It says, "Now the whole world had one language and a common speech. And as people moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. And they said to each other, 'Come, let's make bricks and bake them thoroughly.' They used brick instead of stone and tar for mortar." Now, that's a really important piece because what it shows is that they're not using natural created things, but they're actually creating things of their own. They're using human technology and advancements in order to build this tower. That's a key piece. And boy, does that come out in Final Fantasy 16 Echoes, right? I mean, that's major. So they're using human-built materials. And they say, "Let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth." Now, I'm going to stop there because this is a way that the Hebrews are retelling this story and they're retelling this mythos. When they're discussing tower, though, archaeology really helps us understand this a little bit more. We think of a tower that goes straight up. We think of like buildings in large cities, New York City, that sort of thing. That's not exactly what's going on. Instead, we're looking at more of a ziggurat, right? We're looking at a giant, almost terraced tower. But what's interesting is these are iconic in Babylon. These towers where there would be tiers and terraces of gardens. And each one, there's a different garden, and it's supposed to go all the way up. And their idea is we're going to build a terraced tower that goes all the way up to the heavens. Because why? They're trying to get back to the original garden. They're trying to get back to that original place from which they were expelled. So the idea is if God cast us out, we're coming back. Okay, we're going to build it with our own ingenuity. And Final Fantasy XVI does that so well here, right? I mean, just from the machinations that they are building, the beasts that they're creating, they are trying to recreate using their own means. Everything from the crystals to the beings. I just thought it was phenomenal. Thoughts on that, MJ, before we keep going?
Just to echo that, a couple of things. I absolutely love where you're going with this. I the ziggurat in particular is something I want to come back to at the end of the stream because I think that ties directly into the mother crystals in a very, very specific way. Okay.
I'm excited. Yes. Well, let's put a pin in that. That's good.
We'll put a pin in that one. One of the things I absolutely loved is as part of this Tower of Babel, we have genetic experimentation going on.
Yeah.
And in pop culture, the if you were to use the phrase, and this crops up in Hollywood all the time, if you were to use the phrase "playing God,"
oh boy, yes,
it's almost exclusively used when talking about genetic experimentation. So the fact that we're talking about the Tower of Babel, we're talking about humans trying to get the secret knowledge of the gods, and then they've introduced specifically in this tower the playing gods element of genetic experimentation to sort of create the dust crystals. I thought that was absolutely brilliant. Another thing that I thought was really cool is that in the tomes lore as well, they actually refer to the Sage Spire as a tower of ivory. Now, an ivory tower can obviously be used as a metaphor for a place where people deliberately isolate themselves from the rest of the world, so that they can pursue their own needs and interests. And quite often, it's to do with like really quite dark or clandestine or mysterious stuff. And this to actually literally this representation of the Tower of Babel, to actually have it in that sort of white fallen stone material, literally creates this ivory tower. So I thought that was fantastic. And one other little addition to that is that obviously when we were talking prior to the DLC, we were talking about the sins of Zemeckis. We're talking about man's hubris and being able to reach the heavens, but the context of that was they built airships. So to actually have an airship hangar as part of this tower was just, that's absolutely amazing. It's so on the nose. It's unreal.
Yeah, and you even take mid-side quest, or I think it's a main story quest. No, it is a side quest when she's building the airship, the actual ship. Sometimes they kind of mesh together, okay? But when she's doing that, she holds back. After it's like, okay, well, this didn't exactly work the way I wanted to, but I'm getting rid of this stuff because this is going to be for future generations. And I thought that was some restraint that she was able to hold. I thought that was an interesting piece, especially with this new context of the airships.
Yeah, absolutely. And one other thing just to sort of highlight there is that as part of those, I actually think they're part of the main quest, because we need to use the Invincible as no, it's the Enterprise midship, isn't it? We have to build the ship, so I think that's actually part of the main quest. But remember the bit with the quest where they're trying to find a way to keep the temperature down?
Yes.
So they effectively they come up with this black tar-like substance.
Yeah.
Which might tie back into the Tower of Babel story of actually using tar as well.
Yeah, that's a really interesting thing too. I didn't even think about that, but using tar and it's right there again in Genesis chapter 11. That's great stuff. That's great stuff.
So, but in addition to that, no, I'm assuming that you're kind of going to move on to how this directly then connects to Zemeckis. Is that where you're going with this?
No, eventually, yeah, yeah, for
Okay,
sure,
well,
for sure.
I'll kind of pass the torch back to you then.
No, no worries, no worries. This is rich. This is really rich. I think that my students next fall are gonna like. This is gonna be one of their lectures for sure. Um, I'm going to continue reading the Genesis account. It says that they're building this ziggurat here, and it says. That we may reach the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth. Now, the Hebrew people, as they're compiling their stuff here, this is not just a retelling, but it's also in some ways an indictment of the philosophy of Babylon. I think that's a really, really important piece here because um, Babylon is the power that took them in, that enslaved them, basically, or didn't enslave them, but occupied them, sent them into exile into Babylon, right? And so there's a resentment, even though they're living in this land. And you've got Nebuchadnezzar, who is the king of Babylon, and there's a fascinating story where he's walking among his gardens on a balcony, and he looks over everything, and he says, "Look at this thing that I have created," and he is filled with all of this hubris. And it says that God curses Nebuchadnezzar, that he has feathers and hair that grows out, and he has talons, and he almost becomes like a werewolf bird-like monster sort of thing. And then it says it's only when he repents of that and turns back to God and acknowledges his humanity that is his sanity then restored. And so it's almost like, very weirdly, he loses his mind, lives in a carnal sort of instinct, almost like an Akashic, but that's a whole other uh, side avenue here. But then he is returning back, and his sanity is restored. Here, you can't read Genesis chapter 11 without saying this is an indictment on the way that Babylon thought they were reaching the heavens and God, and that's just not for humanity to do. We can't play God. Now, they didn't have cloning and genetics and all that kind of stuff, as you mentioned, but in the same ways, there seems to be this ethical dilemma of, as technology advances, where do we overstep our bounds? And how are we trying to reach into the heavens and play God? Well, I kind of want to go here and finish out the story. It says, "But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower the people were building. And the Lord said, if as one people speaking the same language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us," key emphasis there, "let us go down and confuse their language so that they will not understand one another." And I appreciate the Genesis 11 account, really the first 11 chapters of Genesis, using that first person plural whenever God is speaking, because it does speak to this idea of a pantheon of gods. Israel, oftentimes associated with a monotheistic theology, they struggled with monotheism. That's the long and short of it. While it was like, have no other gods before me, and yet they tried to make their god top, but they had all the others as well, and there was always this competition. So here it says that the spokesperson, the Lord, is saying to the rest of the divine, let's go down there and fix this, and kind of muddle this up for them, confuse them. And so the Lord scattered them from there over all the earth, and they stopped building the city. That's why it was called Babel, because the Lord confused the language of the whole world. From there, the Lord scattered them all over the face of the whole earth. And that, I think, is where we begin to go into this sins of Zemeckis sort of thing, where there is this cataclysmic moment. Now, even as we revisit this Babel story and kind of bring in some of this other stuff, I actually do want to read one more thing, and then I'm going to hand it over to you to kind of process this with the sins of Zemeckis. What I'm about to read comes from a Sumerian epic called Enmerker and the Lord of Arada. And there's a really interesting piece here that doesn't go into the tower narrative, but it goes into the result of it. And it says, once upon a time, there was no snake, no scorpion, no hyena, no lion. There was no wild dog, no wolf, no fear, no terror, and man had no rival. In those days, the lands Shunbar and Hamazi, harmony-tongued Sumer, the great land of the decrees of princeship, Uri, the land having all that is appropriate, the land Martu, resting in security, the whole universe, the people in unison, to enlil in one tongue. Then Ada, the Lord, Ada the prince, Ada the king, Inki, Ada the Lord, Ada the prince, Ada the king, and it goes through many others. Ultimately, all of this pantheon of gods that's invoked here says, Inki, the Lord of abundance, whose commands are trustworthy, the Lord of wisdom, who understands the land, the leader of the gods, endowed with wisdom, charged the speech into their mouths, brought contention into their speech, into the speech of man that until then had been one. And it is this idea that for some reason in this pantheon of gods, it is the divine will that humanity will be divided. And then all of these separate texts and stories were like, well, why would they do that? Is it because the gods value diversity, or is it because there is a fear that humanity working together may attain the heights of the gods? And so it's the difference between a god who is self-assured and a little, concerned about that security. How does all of this play into the sins of Zemeckis for you?
Well, I think the direct contrast there in terms of Enki and the gods from Sumeria, it's almost a direct reversal of the philosophy behind what Ultima was trying to do with mankind. That he gave creation to mankind so that eventually mythos could rise.
Mm-hmm.
But it is throughout the game, and particularly in the tomes, it time and time again says that Ultima did not consider that mankind would have its free will.
Mm-hmm.
If mankind doesn't have free will, then there's no individualism, which means that Ultima, the kind of the 16 manifestations of Ultima that appear within the game are a hive mind, they're a shared consciousness, which means that mankind would also be part of this shared consciousness.
Yeah.
So the idea here that you're talking about the Mesopotamian gods giving mankind effectively individualism, free will, their own languages, their own cultures, is the exact opposite of what Ultima was attempting to do.
Mm-hmm.
Which I really like that idea. And not necessarily to go down this route just now, but it also plays kind of into the same idea of the demiurge trying to replicate the ultimate god's idea of creation, but getting it wrong, sort of thing. But I think because Ultima's oversight in this instance is effectively what led to the equivalent of the Tower of Babel is really quite interesting, because it was the for the fallen, it was their free will, it was their determination to learn and to emulate the divine and to gain secret knowledge that led to Ultima saying, no, enough's enough.
Right.
And then even by casting Primogenesis again and sort of returning an awful lot of mankind to this Akashic state where effectively he is taking away the individualism again, he is removing the free will. But even then, when you go to Tabor, for example, you get information about how the tribes, because apparently the people of Tabor are the natives of Zemeckis, or they're descended from the natives of Zemeckis.
Yeah.
But they talk about how there was kind of three principal groups of people who with slightly different beliefs following the sins of Zemeckis that went in different ways, and that is eventually what became like Sanbreque, what became Rosario, what became the Crystalline Orthodoxy, things like that. So the tomes themselves actually talk quite specifically about how these different cultures are actually all derived from there. But what I find interesting is that Ultima effectively made the same mistake twice.
Mm-hmm.
That the first time free will was an oversight, and then even when he had to destroy or attempted to destroy mankind, there were still cultures that remained.
Yeah.
And although they sort of gave up use of magic for a little while and so on and so forth, but he still didn't return them all to this Akashic state, which then gives rise to what eventually becomes Final Fantasy XVI. So I find it really interesting that, like I said, that contrast, that Ultima, what Enki does is the exact opposite of what Ultima's attempting to achieve, really. But beyond that, there's nothing that I feel that I can really add to that. I guess.
Sure.
What about you? What do you feel is?
I think that with this, number one, you've got Ultima, who is kind of pulling the strings throughout the entire game, but with the DLC, we are seeing kind of the response to this in some ways, and that response to it ends up becoming the human's undoing. The thing that I keep coming back to with this is that toward the end of the DLC, you've seen all of these machinations. You see this like fervency that even Famiel doesn't really fully understand. It's just, this is who we are. This is our culture. This is what we've always been about. And then he has to have this understanding of like, okay, we may have been noble in our pursuits, but the way we went about it was absolutely the wrong way. And so he has to come to an alignment again with Clive. And I think that that's an interesting piece here. Now, one thing with Ultima, there was the desire to make everyone Akashic, but in some ways, by creating all of these different crystals with their different corresponding respective mythos, there are cultures that come around those. And I think that Tomes even reminds us of the motes that began to appear. And it was different elemental motes, and these became almost identities that were harvested, were protected, sources of power, and they created distinction, differentiation from others. And so there was some level of separation, distinction, and scattering that would happen until Clive shows up to be that ultimate vessel to reunite them all. So I think that we see a little bit of both of these things. But again, I think it's interesting that Ultima and all of the, quote, Ultimas, in some ways show a different side of that gem, and then ultimately coalesce together. As we kind of come in for a landing, because I only want to go for about maybe 10 more minutes or so if you've got time, the idea of, we haven't spoken about Omega at all. What might you say about Omega, and how is that in some ways the antithesis of Ultima, even man-made?
Well, I'm glad you asked.
Yeah.
If you only have 10 more minutes, that's fine. I actually don't have a time limit here.
Well, I want to be respective of your time, but we can go a little bit more. So
okay, sure. Well, good, because I actually have quite a bit to say.
Oh gosh, save some for the book, brother.
Okay. I mean, this is primarily just the DLC. So if we're having this,
I know, man,
this level of conversation only about the DLC, just imagine the volume of the book.
Can't imagine.
Okay, so I'm in hindsight, I'm not surprised at all that the first DLC related to Omega.
Mm.
Like, at all. I actually loved in particular that the Greek letter omega appears in the title as well.
Yeah. Oh gosh. Yeah.
And the word echoes. So just to sort of give a bit of context as to why this doesn't surprise me is that omega is the last letter of the ancient Greek alphabet. Is typically used to represent the end as well. So that's when we talk about omega, that's what it means. It's the last. It's the end. The end of something. Okay. So the fact that the DLC it has to take place after Primal Genesis has been cast.
Yeah.
Which we end up with this sort of Primal Genesis is a really interesting one in Final Fantasy 16 because Primal Genesis itself invokes this apocalyptic time. It's the end of the world. That's how it's portrayed. Like they actually like the tomes talk about how the people of Ash call this Arche and that it's happened before and it's the harbinger of the end times. Like that's how they interpret it. Okay, but that's not what the words mean. Like Primogenesis, it's actually a term that it means like the first or the origin of something, like sort of the inception of, or not inception, the kind of concept of an idea, like, or like the first of a species, like, or an entity or an idea in its earliest form, kind of thing. So when we talk about Omega being the end or the last, Primogenesis, it's actually the exact opposite. It could represent the Alpha, which is really interesting in terms of the people of Valisthea are looking at the dark skies. They're looking at Primogenesis and they think it's the end times. They think it's the end of the world. But to Ultima, the point of Primogenesis is that it's a way of turning mankind Akashic and returning them to their original state. So he's removing their free will. And he says he's actually making them divine. He's, which is a reference to original sin, which is another Garden of Eden parallel.
Right.
So the term Primogenesis here means like earliest form. So when Primogenesis and Akashic are effectively returning mankind back to their earliest state, what their state was intended to be. Arche is an ancient Greek word that means exactly the same thing. It just means beginning or origin. But again, in the context of the story, this is the end of the world, and Final Fantasy XVI really, really heavily plays on that in terms of plays on the end of the world, sort of symbolism, iconography, atmosphere. The last two weapons that Clive can craft at the end of the game are Ragnarok, which is the Norse apocalypse, and Götterdämmerung, which is Richard Wagner's kind of later interpretation of the Ragnarok tale. We have creatures showing up that are directly related to Revelations in the Christian bit, like the Behemoth, for example, exclusively shows up in Ash at the end of the game after Primogenesis has been cast. So again, we're and Revelation talks about God killing the Leviathan, God killing the Behemoth.
Yep.
So when we start to think about Omega in that context, we are talking about beginning and the end again. Yeah. One of the most famous uses.
Or I might even say, depending on how you kind of interpret this, Omega represents both the beginning of the end, but also the end of the beginning, right? Because it's
that's exactly where I'm going with
this.
Okay. Okay.
Sorry, I'm jumping to the end.
No. But I'm glad you did, because I'm the long story short is Final Fantasy 16, the symbolism is all about cycles,
Yes.
right? Okay, so obviously Omega, one of the most famous usages in literature is from Revelations. I'm the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end.
Yep.
Which is of course spoken by Jesus. Interestingly, that exact line in Revelations is preceded by another line which contains "My reward is with me," which is the name of the trophy that you earn for crafting the Omega weapon after you complete the DLC. So again, right on the nose with that one.
Yeah, always on the nose in this game. I love it.
So where I'm going with this is that Primogenesis and Arche effectively represent the Alpha. Omega, of course, represents the end. So we, at the point in which the Echoes of the Fallen DLC takes place, is the end of Final Fantasy 16. It's effectively what could be presented as the end of the current civilization, particularly with the use of magic. But the context of the story and what we're about to learn about is how the current civilization came about. So it's the fall of the fallen, the beginning of the current civilization. Now we're at the end of the current civilization, and we're about to go and learn about the fall of the fallen again through the vehicle, literally, of Omega.
Right.
So we get Omega, Alpha. Rise of the Fallen, Rise of the Current, or Fall of the Fallen, Rise of the Current Civilization, Fall of the Current Civilization, which then starts to play into this idea of cycles. So I don't know if you noticed that the entire time you spend at the Sage Spire, it's at dusk.
Yeah.
Which dusk is the end of the day. So that's another end that we're talking about. Dusk crystals, again, and we're making reference to the day. So like when I'm talking about cycles in Final Fantasy 16, there's a very, very specific reason for cycles and this being used. And going back to sort of ancient times, when mythos was used rather than logos, like the logos here we know is how the universe works. We know that the sun rises because the earth is spinning, and we have to go through this. The earth is orbiting the sun, so it's not the the earth is still and the sun's appearing. It's that we are spinning around the sun. Same idea with the moon, right?
Yeah. We
know that a day is because a day lasts because that's the full revolution. That's the logos of it. The seasons occur because we are different distances from the sun. The earth is on an axis. That's the logos. But the mythos associated with that in ancient times was we have to tell stories about why does the sun rise every day? Why does it set every day? Why are the seasons? Why can we only harvest crops at particular times of the season? Or particular times of the year, and so on. It's like why does the moon, go through its entire cycle of oh God, what's the word I'm looking for? The forms of the moon, basically the 28-day cycle. So all the ancient cultures came up with stories, and a lot of this is to do with, the Egyptians, for example, spoke about Ra rising. Yeah. Ra was in the sunboat, so he rises from the underworld at the start of the day, crosses the sky, goes back into the underworld at night, fights, and goes through all these various challenges, and then he rises again. So the Egyptians had a direct association between the cycle of the sun and the underworld. Other cultures, like the story of Persephone, for example, was the story of why the vegetation only starts to come back in the spring. So the idea was that Hades stole Persephone. Persephone was the goddess of spring. but she was only allowed to return to the gods or to the upper world every 6 months. So her return to the upper world would herald spring, but her return to Hades in the underworld would be autumn into winter, which is why there was no vegetation so that's the mythos element, okay? And what you tend to see across many cultures is this association between cycles and death in the underworld, so particularly the cycle of birth, life, death, rebirth.
Right.
Okay. So we then get a huge amount of symbolism in Final Fantasy XVI about death and rebirth.
Mm-hmm.
Phoenix being the most obvious one.
Right.
Right. We also get Joshua being Joshua's name in Greek, I believe, is or Yeshua is Jesus.
Yeah.
Jesus, of course, in Christianity is the resurrection is one of the most powerful parts of Christian belief.
And for the first few centuries was analogous with the phoenix.
Exactly.
That was an early Christian symbol, appropriated from the Greek. Yeah.
So again, the Egyptian god of death and rebirth was Osiris, whose death and being brought back to life specifically relates to the Nile River and kind of the fluctuation of how that during the seasonal process sort of the Nile will spread and it will bring fertility to the lands and so on and so forth, which is why the death of Osiris is very closely related to the reeds and his body being cut up and hidden amongst the reeds, which is very likely why the three reeds in Rosaria crops up, because there's all sorts of Egyptian mythology kicking about in three reeds. Another one is there are countless parallels that I'm not going to get into between Clive and Dionysus in Greek mythology. One of which is that Dionysus, in addition to being a god who represented rebirth, or more specifically, victory over death is what Dionysus represented. He is very closely associated with wine and the harvesting of grapes. But he represented kind of freedom and he was a patron of slaves. He was a patron of the oppressed.
Yeah.
He kind of cast off the shackles of people who were oppressed and allowed them to sort of enter his retinue, which is really interesting because the first village that Clive ever encounters, where it's made up entirely of bearers or kind of former slaves, is Lostwing.
Yeah.
And Lostwing, of course, has its own vineyard.
Yeah.
So it's really quite specific.
Yeah.
The connection there, but we can go on for days about this. Like the dragoon names. You fight four kind of lead dragoons, which are basically named after dawn, midday, sunset, and midnight. And like it all comes down to like the circle of Malleus, like the name of the religion for Ultima literally has the word circle in it.
Right.
I've completely gone off.
No, this stuff is delicious. So I mean, I love it.
The point I'm getting at is alpha omega. Okay.
Yeah. I think there's also something really interesting as we're talking about the fallen and how they are called that, but not because they were fallen, but because number one, they fell from the divine plan. Number two, they're called the fallen because they literally fell, right? Like they literally fell. But as they were contesting God or contesting the gods, it led to them into this fallen state. Meanwhile, one thing that I could not help but think about in retrospect after playing through the DLC was when Clive makes his way to the Bahamut battle. He's assimilated several gods at this point, but this is the moment where they are heading literally to the heavens. I mean, in this battle, and where others had fallen and failed, this is where we get to see Ifrit risen for the first time, and we're able to see Clive doing things in a way that is different from the fallen, even though some of those intentions overlap and there's a Venn diagram where they're the same. He's doing it his own way, and he is not going to be fallen. He is going to be invoke this era of risenness. And I think that you cannot. I can't think about the fallen without also thinking about Clive Ifrit risen in this, and how that, in addition, it becomes the beginning of the end. If Omega and that weapon against the gods is the end of the beginning and a beginning of an end, then we're seeing with Clive here the beginning of the end of this saga. And I think it's a beautiful parallel, but again, to that cycle nature that you're discussing. Good stuff. Good stuff.
Absolutely. So when we actually get onto Omega, Omega itself, so not even the concept of Omega, it's filled to the brim. And one of the things I loved in advance is that as you work your way through the tower, like the bosses you come up against, like Sigma, Omicron, obviously letters from the Greek alphabet. Also called like the creatures that are in stasis and released. Like the tower actually says like subjects alpha through epsilon have been released. So it's really funny that we're actually working towards the end of the alphabet.
That's interesting, because I was picking up on the letters and I was like, what is it trying to spell to me? And I was like, is it Soma? Are we doing something around Soma? But I couldn't make anything else out of that.
I think, with the exception of Sigma, I think they're actually just in alphabetical order.
Yeah.
As we work our way through, and incidentally, just as a little offshoot, the word just for the audience listening in, the word alphabet is actually based on the Greek. For the first two letters in the Greek alphabet, alpha and beta. That's literally what it means.
That's a fun fact.
Alpha, beta.
Dazzle people at parties with that, everybody. That's a good one.
There you go. You get that for free.
That's it.
So when we actually fight the boss itself, the second phase of the boss is called Omega Aeonios. So Aeonios is an ancient Greek word that refers to a specific period of time. So usually it's considered to be like or it's misinterpreted as like eternal or forever, but it doesn't actually mean that. It means like a window of time, and quite often that window of time is like an age, an aeon, kind of thing, but it doesn't have to be. It could also actually just mean like a century or a season.
Yeah.
But so when you take that, basically what you're saying is a window of time, Aeonios. So Omega Aeonios is end time, which again, like the end times.
Okay.
So we're talking about Ragnarok.
Oh, I like that.
Talking about the apocalypse. So I thought that was a really cool.
Oh, that's gold. That's great.
Okay, so so Omega itself is created as an iconoclast. Or clasty. I think it's I don't know how you pronounce that. I'm afraid. I know a lot of things, but that's not one of them. I'm afraid.
Fair.
But so the idea here is that Omega existed before the icons did. So the icons of Valisthea didn't actually appear for a couple of centuries after the fall of the Fallen. So we basically it was created to overthrow the gods, and actually some of them were created to fight their enemies in the Magitek War. So it goes into a little bit of. I think this is the same thing in the tomes during Final Fantasy 16. It talks about the War of the Magi, which is pre-Sins of Zemeckis and it relates to different factions of the Fallen trying to fight for control of the Mother Crystals.
Mm-hmm.
But during Echoes of the Fallen, they make reference to the Magitech War, so I'm not sure if they're talking about the same thing. I think they are,
Yeah, that
but
was ambiguous to me.
um, I'm not 100% sure. But basically, the point is that some of these weapons were actually created to fight against other fallen
Yeah.
cultures or civilizations. But Omega, particularly in it, Omega is one of the most powerful. That basically the word klastos in ancient Greek. When we speak to Harpocrates, like towards the end of the DLC, he says that the iconoclast means destroyer of the divine,
Mm-hmm.
which implies, of course, that the iconoclasts were designed to overthrow Ultima, overthrow the gods, which makes sense. But Klastos is a very, very, very interesting word choice, because the ancient Greek word klastos doesn't just mean destroy. What it actually means is something more close to like breaking up or fragmenting or separating into parts.
Yeah.
Right? So when the icons themselves later take the name of the iconoclast, so it's not basically where I'm going with this is that the icons are fragmented parts of Ultima's overall power, and the point of Mythos is to gather that power to become the vessel for Ultima. So Mythos is effectively the point of that is to bring together
The rejoining
the iconic power.
Yeah.
Whereas iconoclast itself specifically means to fragment or to separate the iconic power.
Mm-hmm.
So to then pit Mythos against Omega is basically this direct contrast in what their purpose is.
Oh, that's an interesting piece, because it would be especially at this point in the story, because he is the culmination, he is the mythos of all of these different things, and then you have the separator of that
Exactly.
mythos. That's good. That's really good.
So I found, which is why I felt the word klastos was really, really specific. Like it kind of felt too deliberate.
Well, yeah, and
Okay.
it definitely goes. I mentioned this on my lecture play last night, that in the post-Reformation era, there was the rise of these reformers called iconoclasts, and they would go into cathedrals, into religious areas, and they would try to separate out by destructive means the destruction of graven images, of images in general, statues, stained glass in some cases. To try to separate out, I like that translation, separate out the divine from housing the divine. We can't worship the graven image. We have to worship the actual divine, and that can't be done through these representations. So we're gonna to do that by destroying it.
I didn't realize actually that it's derived from a real life term as
Yeah,
well.
that's
That makes
exactly it.
so as probably even more deliberate that's where they've got that from.
Yeah. Wait, and earlier in the semester streams, I talked about how Clive was an iconoclast breaking up these religious relics, which were the mother crystals. But boy, it really comes to light here in the Fallen
Yeah.
DLC, because I mean that's what they were trying to do, except more pointed toward God,
Yeah,
the
exactly.
divine. So interesting stuff. Gosh, good stuff.
So I've one final point
Yeah, please.
to do with Omega, and you could maybe help me with this, as I'm right in thinking that you've played Final Fantasy 14.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
All,
Okay.
all
So
of them.
okay, good. So I'm very interested in Final Fantasy 14. I've never personally played it, but I have invested a lot of time into learning about the story. But because I've not played it, I think there are a lot of things that I've probably missed, a lot of kind of winks and nods or derivations from Final Fantasy XIV that have cropped up in Final Fantasy XVI that I've overlooked for that reason. One of the ones that I didn't overlook, however, or I assume that I didn't overlook, is the Omega reference from Final Fantasy XIV. So, and I'm hoping this isn't. I'm right in thinking that Omega appears at the end of Heavensward.
At the end of Stormblood, yeah.
As the end of Stormblood,
Yeah,
right?
as
Okay,
a optional raid.
Okay, right. So apologies if this is a minor spoiler to anyone who has not got that far in Final Fantasy XIV. But basically, when the player comes up against or learns about Omega, they actually learn that its purpose is that it was created to defeat Midgardsormr, which is the great dragon that was killed at the Silvertear Falls during a huge release of ether. So Midgardsormr, I understand, came from another planet and was the father of the first brood of dragons, you know, Hraesvelgr, Nidhogg, etc. So when Midgardsormr died, it was kind of wrapped around the was it the Agres? Is that right? The airship that when there was the explosion of ether at Silvertear Falls, it effectively, you know, the explosion killed Midgardsormr, and then there was just this sort of, you know, stuck in stasis, wrapped around this fallen airship.
Yep. That it has been literally years. I started playing that in 2012, and so I'm reaching back. But yeah.
Okay, so where I'm going with this is that in Final Fantasy XVI, Omega is revealed to have been the iconoclast designed to overthrow the gods. Okay, as we learn later in Final Fantasy XVI, is that the mother crystals themselves contain the essence of Ultima. So they actually contain the essence of God.
Okay.
Mother crystals, of course, are named after parts of a drake.
Oh, that's it. Oh, that's interesting.
Okay. So they're all not, specifically they're named after what the tomes refer to as the first worm, which is a legendary drake. Okay, so the fall of Zemeckis is the destruction of one of these drakes, gods, which parallels the airships falling out of the sky, the fallen airships. So the story of Omega going after Midgardsormr in Final Fantasy XIV refers to, or kind of parallels Omega going after the Mother Crystals and Ultima in Final Fantasy XVI, and then through the sins of Zemeckis, the Zemeckis itself, the Mother Crystal, is destroyed, as are the airships, in the same way that Midgardsormr is killed while being wrapped around the Agres airship during this explosion of ether. Again, the explosion of ether, or the Primogenesis, is cast by Ultima as part of the sins of Zemeckis, causing ether floods. Therefore, we've got this explosion of ether floods. All of it's actually really quite similar in my view, which is I don't know how well I've articulated that, because I'm again.
That's incredible. So what do you make of that? Like, how do people understand the overall story of Final Fantasy XVI with that nugget? Because that's a pretty big find, I would say. And chat, I see some mind blown emojis in the chat right now. Yeah, I mean that's huge.
So I don't know how that impacts, or I think it's maybe a a reference or an allusion to Final Fantasy 14 rather, or basically just taking a similar idea and running with it. Because Mihiro, the writer of Final Fantasy 16, is also the writer of Heavensward.
Yeah.
In which Midgardsormr actually becomes quite a key part of the story, and in fact, the dragons overall are a really important part of the story. So, so I guess this leads me back to the last thing that I wanted to talk about, which, if you think that's going to blow your minds, I'm
hit us with it. Let's go.
Okay, so is there, before we go into it, is there anything else that you wanted to kind of talk about through?
I've got
through
some
the DLC.
I've got some wrap up questions. I mean, you mentioned Final Fantasy 14. I think the chat said. I do want to correct something. Dave Zarek says Omega does appear at the end of Heavensward, but the raid is at the end of Stormblood. So yeah, both. Right on. Teamwork makes the dream work, baby. But there are allusions to Final Fantasy 14 all throughout. In fact, the DLC, the music intonation, I think there's like Azisla, there's elements of some of the later raids musically that we begin to get as well. So really cool stuff there. But no, hit us with this, and then I'll do some kind of wrap up questions to bring us in for a landing.
So, this is something that I thought about really a long time before Final Fantasy 16 was released. I didn't know what the context of it was going to be specifically, but now that we have all the information, I think it was right to begin with, right? And I actually discussed this with a few other content creators at the time, but it never really went anywhere. Anyway, so the name Valisthea, in my mind, there are two words that jump out here. The first one is Val, and the second is Thea. So Val is actually can be or in Norse language or in some Germanic languages, it means the slain or the fallen, right? But in the context of a battle, so like someone who's slain in battle, that's what Val refers to. So we see this in like Valhalla, for example, which is the halls of the slain, which is where Odin resides. And Thea is it means that which is divine, but it's a female, a female that is divine. Basically, in another way, it's a female goddess or divinity. Okay, so we've got Valisthea itself refers to slain or fallen goddess, right? That's or something or the goddess of the slain or something to that effect, right? Okay, so a lot of the mythology and theology that appears within Final Fantasy 16, not all of it, like there's quite a lot of Egyptian stuff, there's quite a lot of Hinduism.
Sure.
Those are a bit separate, but quite like the sort of Indo-European stuff, the Greek stuff, Slavic, Norse, some Celtic, to an extent. A lot of it is actually derived from Mesopotamian lore. So you could call that the origin of the tales, if you want.
I like it. A good nod.
I'm here all day. Okay, so this is where it gets really quite interesting, particularly through the echoes of the fallen. Okay, so
thanks for the follow.
We were talking about the Tower of Babel, and quite a lot of the Tower of Babel, as it appears in literature, is really just a parable of trying to explain sort of how different cultures, how different tribes have different languages, and so on and so forth. Okay, but historically, quite a lot of scholars have actually tried to identify whether or not a Tower of Babel existed.
Yeah.
and amongst known structures. And the one that it most often points towards, and again, forgive me if I've butchered the name on this, but I think it's Temenanki,
Temenanki?
which is a ziggurat, even, which existed in Babylon and was dedicated to the supreme god of the Babylonian, specifically the Babylonian kind of pantheon, which is Marduk. Marduk, like many other kind of supreme gods and pantheons, was a storm god. And you can almost directly equate Marduk with Zeus or Jupiter, because he's effectively fifth generation down from the sort of the chaos being, or so in Greek mythology, for example, or certainly in Hesiod's Theogony, we get chaos, the existence of chaos, or you know, or of nothingness, if you want to call that the first generation. One of the first primordial deities that's born is Gaia, who then gives birth to Uranus, and between them they give birth to Kronos, who is the father of Zeus. Okay. Same idea with Marduk. Marduk's actually quite a few generations back from the first being, right? But he is a storm god, and one of the most prominent motifs in mythology, certainly in the European mythology, but almost universally, is the Chaos Kampf. This idea of kind of the culture hero, or the storm god in particular, is very commonly a storm god taking on the primordial chaos being, which is often represented as a serpent.
Yeah.
Okay.
Huh.
So, do you know where I'm going with this?
Yes, but I'm not going to spoil it. I'm going to let you do it. It just clicked. Yeah.
Okay. In the Babylonian creation myth, Marduk is fifth generation, born from the salt water goddess, the primordial chaos goddess Tiamat.
Yep.
Now, Tiamat is the saltwater goddess whose consort was the freshwater god Abzu, and the gods themselves murdered Abzu. And if I've got my mythology correct, it's the actual generation of gods that murdered Abzu was the Anunnaki, which were the parents and grandparents of Marduk. So Tiamat, at the death of Abzu, goes absolutely bananas and releases quite a lot of monsters. But at this stage, she is believed, or certainly depicted in most versions of the story, as taking on this sort of draconic or serpentine form, which is often equated with Leviathan as a side note, but particularly Tiamat is called draconic, which is why in Final Fantasy series, although the Tiamat that they use stems from Dungeons and Dragons, that's where it comes from, this dragon idea.
Yeah.
In the creation story, Marduk earns the right to be king of the gods because he takes on Tiamat and kills her, and then uses her body, uses her corpse to create parts of the world. Like her ribs become the vault of heaven and earth, her eyes become the source of the main rivers, her tail becomes the stars, the Milky Way, so on and so forth, right? So basically where I'm going with this is that we have the Tower of Babel story and the echoes of the fallen, which relates specifically to the fallen taking on the gods. And the story in Mesopotamian myth relates to the key god, or the supreme god, forming parts of the world out of the original, the chaos monster, the dragon, which is probably where the idea for Ultima naming the mother crystals after the first worm the
Uh-huh.
legendary Drake comes from. So when we then talk about Valisthea, we have the slain goddess Tiamat, is why the mother crystals are named after a
Yeah.
dragon.
That's it. That's exactly it. That's exactly it. And like, oh my gosh. So like when you started telling that story, immediately I was like, oh my gosh, it's Tiamat's body. That's why you've got Drake's head, Drake's tail, all of this stuff, and that's exactly it. Valisthea, the fallen god, right, or the fallen of the divine, and
It's,
that perfectly explains it. That's
it's,
beautiful.
it's also probably why they lay that seed right at the beginning of the story with Tiamat being Clive's commander.
Uh huh. Oh, beautiful, beautiful. That's delicious. That's good. That's
So I can't see chat. I hope chat enjoyed that one.
Chad did. I mean, they've got a lot of mind blowns, a lot of nods, a screaming blue faced emoji. So that I think that's a good sign. I think that's really good.
I'll take that as a good sign. Do you want an extra little tidbit to add that one?
Yeah, hit me.
This one's not as good,
A
right?
chaser for that shot.
Okay, okay. So, what actually one going back a little bit, one of the things we didn't mention is after Zemeckis, one of the key. Um, we talked about the sins of Zemeckis, referring to the Tower of Babel, the fall of mankind, and the Great Flood.
Yeah.
One of the key cities that arises, which is basically a hub of mankind in Valisthea afterwards, is the Isles of Ark. And of course, the Noah's Ark is the effectively where mankind and all living beings are saved from the Great Flood.
Mm-hmm.
More interestingly than that, the spaceship Origin is located beneath the Isles of Ark. So, this isn't something that's necessarily part of mythology. This is actually part of pulp culture. That since the 1960s, there's been quite a lot of crossover with the concept that the pyramids across the world were actually built by aliens or ancient civilizations. So I'm not. I kind of know the basics on this one, so I'm not going to go into it in any particular depth. But you tend to see a lot of the Sumerian texts and sort of Old Testament texts used as evidence to back up these theories that ancient civilizations came to Earth. And through the Sumerian texts, it's quite often the case that the gods themselves are referred to as the ones that are these ancient extraterrestrials. That is the Anunnaki that came. The Anunnaki are the ones who basically made Tiamat go crazy in the first place, and were the ancestors of Marduk. So we have this additional idea of Ultima and his surviving kind of manifestations came to Valisthea on a spaceship many aeons ago, and you know they effectively created mankind, created civilization, set up the mother crystals. According to me, named them after Tiamat, and basically parallel the pop culture theories of the Anunnaki.
Yeah, no, that's one thing that I appreciate about this game, because that is that's a pretty well known sort of thing, even though it's not really fleshed out or whatever regarding the pyramids. But this game is even bringing things like that into this. And I think it's like, what makes that mythos any different from another mythos, right? The people may not, camp out around it and create a culture around it quite to the same extent, but it is bringing this and assimilating it into this. I think that's an excellent pop culture piece brought in there. I think it's cool.
So, yeah, I love it, and it's these. I'm so glad that again when I first saw like the website go up maybe 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago now for Final Fantasy 16, and saw the name Valisthea.
Oh man,
Like, that's Tiamat. I'm
yeah.
telling you right now, it's Tiamat. And Blitz can contest to this because I sent him a copy of this years ago.
Yeah.
That, but yeah, I'm pretty sure that that's what it's referencing.
And I think that that's so interesting because you and I had different first reactions. With you looking at the mythology and stuff, I see this, and I made a video of this. Like one of my first videos ever was about what is this ancient sacral warfare that's being waged in this trailer? I mean, you've got these communities that are surrounding these crystals and these ideologies of the crystal, and they're going to war because it looked like a very strong warfare game, and it is. Country against country, icon against icon, understanding of God against understanding of God. And what is fascinating is that, again, I'm looking at it from a kind of an ethical logos sort of perspective, theology of this, and you're coming at it from a mythos. And again, you and I are Clive and Joshua over here. Like we are bringing this together, and I think it's absolutely amazing to think about this. I want to ask two final questions, and this is not a huge sort of thing, but I am curious about this from a meta sort of perspective, Q&A sort of thing. Final Fantasy 16 and 7 and all of these Final Fantasies and other JRPGs particularly, they are so good at retelling some of these myths. I contest that Final Fantasy 15 is a sacral kingship narrative rooted in Judeo-Christian history. That was my dissertation. I look at 16. I've done streams about all of these various mythologies and allusions to culture and all of this stuff. You've brought out a myriad tales of this. In a meta sort of way, why do you think that 16 and this DLC in particular, why do you think they are interested in retelling these stories? Like,
the one that particularly jumped out at me, I think so much emphasis is placed on, again, like we kind of spoke about, the current, or the current civilization in Valisthea is made up of a variety of cultures, and towards the end of the game you learn that so many of these cultures are derived from the older, the ancient cultures, the Circle of Malleus kind of thing. So they all have expanded on ideas that effectively come from a common source.
mm-hmm.
One of I think that our modern society has kind of lost sight a little bit of the impact that we are having on both ourselves as a civilization, and we kind of need to go back to the basics. We kind of have to understand the stories again. We have to get back to that which we have in common. But also, I very early on, and I think when Yoshi P spoke about it, he did kind of allude to this idea that the icons themselves are almost like an allegory for nuclear weapons or nuclear powers.
Yeah.
And one of the side effects of that is, not necessarily the how we are, in conflict with one another as a civilization, rather than coming together and being as one, and looking at our common our similarities, but also how we're actually impacting on one another, in particular how we're impacting on the environment. And I think the Blight is a pretty on the nose look at environmentalism and how we live our life. Because in Valisthea, it's basically the use of magic is what's damaging the land. It's damaging the world.
Yeah.
And how they treat bearers is basically how we treat one another, different cultures, different countries, different social. Um, what's the word I'm looking for? People of different social standings,
Mm-hmm.
races, genders. So my takeaway from this is that it's a reminder of we should really be looking at our common things. We should be taking care of our world. We should not be trying to move further and further and advance technologically, and
Mm.
we should scale back in our hubris, because every single one of these, or the whole point of this DLC is a retelling of the Tower of Babel, which was a story all about hubris and how
Mm-hmm.
humanity was divided. So I think the message is, let's avoid that. Let's bring humanity together the way that Clive does. And at the end of Final Fantasy 16, when all the individuals, like the whole point of Final Fantasy 16 is making connections, because that's the one thing that Ultima can't kill.
Yeah.
You make connections, like right at the end scene before they go to Origin. All the individuals that Clive has kind of worked with along the way, they all show up.
Yeah.
I know that a lot of people hated the way that the side quests were in the game, but the side quests, in my opinion, were designed a very specific way, and it's
Yeah.
that the whole point of this story is to show you how one person can build connections, and how that can impact on that person, how it can impact on a village, how it can impact on a culture,
Yep.
and in Clive's case, how it can literally impact on your entire species or the world. But I think that's what the message is. And I think one of the powerful ways to do that is to show, or to show through these ancient stories, and particularly biblical stories,
Yeah.
why hubris is so dangerous. And that's my takeaway from it.
Yeah. You know, myth, mythology, religious stories, you name it. But whenever we talk about mythos, in some cases, we're talking about something that has happened one time in the past, but the thing that elevates it to that status of mythos rather than history is that in some ways, that story is happening again and again and again because it's a universal human
Yeah,
experience. And I think that there's something in the retelling of these stories that presents a human universal truth. That again, like that jewel, we're looking at it from a different angle. And so, what I love is that this story, for whatever reason, for when people play Final Fantasy 16, they take away things. I see the chat is saying things like, when I first saw the trailer, I just thought, oh, Clive is hot. These guys are like religion and all that. Totally understand, right? Like we all catch different things. But for those of you in the chat, when you played the game, it made you feel something. And we're saying this story is helping us feel something because it's a universal human experience, and this story has been told before, and we're bringing out all the different ways that it's been told. Tower of Babel, the story of Tiamat and Marduk, the story of Moses. I did a stream on Moses and Barnabas and divine law and all that kind of stuff. And so, with all of this, I think that Square Enix is so good at retelling human stories in ways that help us immediately care about it again and feel it in the same way that those early cultures and civilizations did. And I think that that's certainly part of it. I want to read a couple of
absolutely.
things in the chat. This is really interesting. Um, One-winged Emma, also thank you for the follow, said, Clive's journey with
I
grief
am
spoke very loud to me. And if we look at current events in our world, if we were all a little like Clive, the world would be a better place. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. Clive, in some ways, shows us, like I said earlier, he's not the fallen, he's the risen, right? He's the one that, is navigating all of these cultures, mythos, and assimilating them and discarding the shadow sides of those to be the full culmination. Or Ultima, in Ultima's image as was goodly intended, I guess. And we can take that to a image of God place in a lot of it. Mesopotamian religions and even Hebrew.
Mhm.
Um, so again, Man, we have really scoured the depths. We've almost gone as long as the DLC itself, which is really funny. Almost 2.5 hours here. And while we could keep going, and I do have to pull the plug here in a second, because I've got some other things later on in the day. But I wanted to end with this conversation. Um, this is the first of two DLCs. Where do you think we're going with the Rising Tide and Leviathan?
You know, in all honesty, I've not given it a huge amount of thought.
Okay.
I think I've been so hung up on Leviathan and the Final Fantasy VII universe for so
Mm,
long, connections to the importance of water dragons and Far Eastern culture that um, there's nothing that actually strikes me about the DLC or the footage of the DLC that it is a Far Eastern culture that they are um, basing this on. So kind of default to, like I spoke about earlier, um, the use of Behemoth in
mm,
Final Fantasy 16 was really quite specific to Behemoth from Revelations,
mm-hmm,
um, which leads me to believe that perhaps they'll do something similar with Leviathan
mm-hmm.
in this one. Um, but
And for those of you that don't know, Behemoth and Leviathan are almost they're two chaos monsters, and so that's why he's making this analogy or connection between Behemoth and Leviathan, kind of doing the same thing here.
so um, I must admit I don't know where they will go with it.
Hmm.
But
Anything you
I'm
hope for from a gameplay standpoint, or from a any lingering questions you want answered?
oh goodness, you've put me on the spot there.
I am.
I don't know if there's anything in particular that I want
Yeah.
answered. Because or maybe I guess I like the whole my theory about the mother crystals being named after Tiamat.
Hmm.
I guess I would kind of just like vindication on some of my ideas,
I think you'll get
or
it. I
a
do.
bit more clarity. So it could be that the route they go down is not specifically the biblical Leviathan, but they also then
Hmm.
look at, you know, how Leviathan in that context might actually compare to Tiamat as the chaos monster. So
Yeah.
that they might actually then bridge that gap a little bit to
Yeah.
explain why the mother crystals were named after named the way they are. But um, yeah, to be honest with you, it's I my only hope is that there is at least as much mythological or theological content within that story as there is in Echoes of the Fallen.
Hmm.
Even if that means that we go to, I expect where we go is somewhere outside of Valisthea,
Oh, really?
because
Okay.
there's quite a few references. There's certainly there's a continent to the south that they talk about,
Right.
um, and also Harpocrates talks about um, him coming from another land, but it's suggested that he came from the north,
Hmm.
which and they also talk about islands as well, where some of the materials or some blades, the blade that you get
Yeah.
from Blackthorn, that you can only use it once, kind of like that. I can't remember the name of the isle. So
I can't
there's
either.
actually there's land masses dotted here and there.
Mm-hmm.
There's a couple of references in in the hideaway
Yeah.
later in the game. You can read something that talks about um, a mysterious island in Eastla.
Mm-hmm.
They also talk about disappearing islands, which is kind of like the uh, Festito Calon, and oh god, what's his
Hmm.
the giant turtle, the
The
giant
jo-
turtle that emerges and then sinks into the ocean. People think he's an island. The Speedo
um
Coloni, that's his name. So I think what they're getting at is that these mysterious islands. I think there's a few references to them actually dotted
Yeah.
in Final Fantasy 16 already. So I expect that's where we're going. But beyond that, no, I don't have much to offer in terms of
Yeah.
speculation. What about you?
Well, for me, we've already kind of hit on it a little bit. We've already talked about in Final Fantasy 16 proper, the main game. We've hit on creation. Now we've hit Tower of Babel. I think with Leviathan and Rising Tide, we're doing the flood narrative. I think it's going to be very, very strongly related to the flood. And if you've ever watched or heard me talk about Leviathan from Final Fantasy 15, there's an incredible analog to the flood narrative there, and especially the divine attribute that may be correlated with that, which is divine regret. It's the one place, or one of two places in the Hebrew Bible where it says that the Lord regretted, and so the Lord regretted that He had made humanity in there, and so I think that we're going to be dealing with Leviathan, and if I were to make a theory. I'm not much of a theory crafter. I leave that to my contemporaries. But if I were to make a theory that would include yours, I think that they're doing something interesting with this draconic image of Leviathan. And since it is Leviathan the Lost, I think it's possible that they're using Leviathan as an avatar stand-in for the Tiamat narrative there, which could be a really interesting thing. Where is
Yeah,
Tiamat, or excuse me, where is Leviathan? Well, it's lost, and maybe we're going to get the story of why
yeah,
Leviathan is lost, and maybe the origin of even Valisthea proper. Who knows? But I think that they're going to uncover the flood narrative, which I'm all for. I think that would be an amazing thing.
yeah.
So.
I would love that. Really, really love that.
Yeah, it'd be incredible. And I think that also if it were to go the route of both the Enuma Elish Epic of Gilgamesh and then a third source, the Genesis account, then I think there would be an interesting play to see, in the Enuma Elish and the Epic of Atrahasis, we've got a one god that is, or one being of divine nature that is conspiring against the other gods that want to kill all of humanity. But then we see all of that synchronized in the Genesis account, which finally ends with this idea of the rainbow. And I'll give everybody something really interesting here. When it talks about divine regret in the Genesis account, the story begins with God saw all the violence on the earth and regretted that He had made humanity, and so He decides to start over through Noah and create an ark. Commands him to build an ark. Let's restart creation. And it's basically, let it die. Cycle's going to continue. First one messed up. We're going to do it right. But at the end of it, you set this rainbow in the sky. And for most of us, we look at the rainbow in 2023 and we see all kinds of things of unity, harmony, love, peace, a nice thing. And yeah, it does mean that. But in the original culture, this rainbow in the sky, arch all the way across, is reminiscent of a weapon of war, where the bow is pointed heavensward and the arrow would be pointed toward the divine. And this is a way that the Hebrew people reappropriated this story to say that one attribute of God is that God is willing to take on the potential loss and regret to allow for people to kind of have that agency of free will. And so it's interesting that this is Leviathan the Lost, because that is so counter to what Ultima wants.
Hmm.
And so that could be an interesting analogy as well, or analog. So I don't know. It's all theory crafting at this point.
Yeah.
But
One other little thing just off the back of that is that
yeah.
obviously during the story of Final Fantasy 16 we learn that Barnabas comes from outside of Valisthea.
Mm-hmm.
Barnabas, of course, is the dominant of Odin. In Norse mythology, the rainbow was the Bifrost, which was the
Yeah.
bridge between the earth and the heavens.
Oh yeah.
So we might see that in there somewhere.
I love it. I love it. Oh my gosh, there's so much that could happen. I love it. Hey, I cannot thank you enough for this time. You've given us 2.5 hours. It's like past midnight where you are now, right? I mean, good grief, you're the best. You're the absolute best.
Listen, I've had a wonderful time. I'm so grateful that I know obviously that we've been looking to do something together for quite some time, and this opportunity presented itself, and I want to thank you, because this is something that in my personal life I don't actually get to share with a lot of people. So being able to sit down and discuss it at length with someone on the same wavelength is just absolute heaven for me. So
it's amazing.
So thank you for your time, and thank you for having me on. I hugely appreciate it.
Yeah, well, everybody, I want to remind you all, go and buy MJ Gallagher's books. I'm holding up Greek Myths that inspired Final Fantasy VII. He's holding it up too here. Yeah, absolutely. Where can they find you? Where can they find all of your stuff, and to go and buy the book?
Sure. If you're looking for everything that's available, the kind of one-stop shop is actually just my own website that's getting off the ground just now, which is www.mjgallagherbooks.com. So that'll have the mythology books and also links to my Nibelheim incident novel as well. But the books themselves are actually just available on Amazon all around the world. So if you just type in Norse myths that inspired Final Fantasy VII or Greek myths that inspired Final Fantasy VII, it will come up on your regional Amazon. The best way, if you are looking to reach out, I am very active on Twitter or X, and it's just at FFVII novels. But yeah, I should be easy enough to find on social media. So I'm massively grateful to everyone stopping by and to listen to me waffle on for 2.5 hours.
Oh man, it has been a treasure. It has been a treasure, and I told the chat in the last couple of weeks that I'm going to be starting a Final Fantasy VII remake lecture play, and man, I got to get you on sometime for that. That's going to be so good.
Absolutely, yeah. Absolutely.
Everybody, I just got to say thank you once again for being a part of all of this. Thank you for the chat. Thank you for hanging out with us. 2.5 hours on a Wednesday afternoon or morning or whatever time you're in is no small feat. I wish I could give you course credit for this. But again, MJ Gallagher, everybody, make sure you follow him at FFVII Novels on Twitter/X. And then buy his book, y'all. Buy his book. Everyone, it's been a delight. I hope that you have a phenomenal Wednesday, and we will see you soon. Bye, everybody. Have a great day.
Take care. See you later.